Mia in my basement, Oshun in my pipes, no trust fund in the 215.
Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames. This is Season 1, Books and Bidders, Adventures in Book Collecting, in which we explore the stories behind fascinating objects in the Rosenbach's collection and engage in critical conversations about the place of rare books, libraries, and museums in modern-day life. In this episode, I'll introduce you to one of my valued colleagues here at the Rosenbach, who probably knows our magnificent collection of rare books and manuscripts better than any other person alive today, Elizabeth E. Fuller, the Librarian of the Rosenbach. I'm sitting with Elizabeth in the cozy reading room at the Rosenbach, where researchers come from around the world to view items from our collection. We'll chat about her Rosenbach origin story, view some of her favorite objects in our collection, and hear more about the people who come to use the collections under her care. Elizabeth will also share some details about how you too can visit the reading room and see some of our collection items. When you hear the word librarian, what or who comes to mind? Maybe you see the public librarian who issued you your first library card when you were a child. Or perhaps you remember a media specialist who helped you with grade school projects. Now, I've known a lot of librarians in my life, but for me, the word librarian is synonymous with my guest today, Elizabeth E. Fuller, Librarian of the Rosenbach. Descended from a long family tradition of librarianship, Elizabeth E. Fuller, or Eve as she is commonly known within the walls of the Rosenbach, embodies many of the attributes one thinks of in a librarian: deep knowledge of the collection, a love for organization and data management, and, perhaps most importantly, a passion for helping the public access and enjoy the collections under her care. An important thing to realize about special collections libraries like the Rosenbach is that the one-of-a-kind nature of their collections and the often idiosyncratic path by which collections were originally formed and then enlarged means that it takes people with a long institutional memory and deep familiarity with the contours of the collection really to make the holdings accessible and decipherable to the public. Elizabeth plays this role at the Rosenbach. She started her career here approximately a year before I, your podcast host, was born, and brings those decades of knowledge and experience to bear on her work in research services and public interpretation. Today, I'm sitting with Elizabeth in the Rosenbach's reading room, surrounded by piles of rare books, manuscripts, and archival documents that she's pulled from the collection. She's going to tell me and you more about the Rosenbach's collections and invite you to come visit our reading room in person. But first, allow me to tell you more about our guest. Elizabeth holds an A.B. in History and Historic Preservation from Goucher College and an A.M. from the University of Chicago Graduate Library School. In a distinguished career at the Rosenbach that has spanned more than 3 decades, Elizabeth has held a variety of responsibilities, ranging from cataloging manuscripts to heading Rosenbach security and managing the library's Reader Services program. She has curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions and is active in the professional community, sitting on the advisory board of the Marianne Moore Digital Archive Notebooks Project. In the past, Elizabeth has also served on the board of the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections Libraries, better known as PACSCL. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me on the Rosenbach podcast today.
Thanks, Alex. It's always good to talk about what we do.
So before we delve into our collections, I'm curious to learn a little bit more about you. I understand that you come from a family of librarians, as we have discussed in the past, and I'm interested in knowing more about what persuaded you also to become a librarian and join that professional community.
Well, I've told the story often, but since you used the word origin story, I've been seeing scenes of it illustrated in comic fashion. We'll see if we can get one of our local artists to do that. My mother and her mother-in-law were both librarians, as was an aunt and a couple of aunts and several cousins. I grew up helping my mother out in our school library, which she ran as a volunteer in the elementary school library. I loved doing it. I found it very hard not to stop what I was doing at the moment and read all the books. And at some point I thought if I worked in a library, I would have this problem all the time. And as I studied a lot of subjects in school, I got all kinds of other ideas about careers. By the time I went to college, I knew I wanted to do something with history. I knew I didn't want to teach. I found that Goucher had a program in historic preservation, which I absolutely loved. I did internships in museums and archives and studied some architectural history, all kinds of things. I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, and I knew I needed a little time off. So I actually went home and temped for a couple of years. One of those jobs turned out to be setting up an in-house library in a small manufacturing company. And I knew exactly where I was when the realization hit me that, yes, this is what I'm supposed to be doing after all. So I'd come back around full circle.
Interesting. So how did you end up at the Rosenbach?
Well, in library school, I concentrated on cataloging. I didn't study special collections. I figured I would end up in a university library cataloging department somewhere. But just as my class was about to graduate, a bunch of us were sitting around one day reading job ads to each other. This is pre-web, so there were printed job ads. And I saw one that was cataloging American historical manuscripts. The name Rosenbach didn't mean anything to me, but I mentioned it. One of my classmates who'd studied special collections said, "Oh, the Rosenbach, you have to apply there." So I sent it out with that week's batch of application letters, and they asked me for an interview, and that's how I got here.
And you've been here ever since?
That's right.
So tell me a little bit more about the nature of the collections at the Rosenbach. Can you give me sort of a bird's eye view of the composition of our collections? And I'm thinking specifically of the rare book and manuscript holdings. What are the areas of special strength here at the Rosenbach?
The single deepest and strongest part of the collection is American historical material from the earliest European explorations of the whole globe, really, especially the North and South America. As we come nearer to the present, the geographical focus sort of narrows to North America and the United States. The bulk of it really ends about time of Reconstruction. The Rosenbach brothers knew that history was being made all the time, but Philip was born during the Civil War and Dr. Rosenbach in 1876, so they weren't focused on collecting material during their lifetime. So we say earliest European explorations up through Reconstruction. English literature is a close second. We go from 15th century manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales up through Dylan Thomas. American literature as well as English literature, visual arts, all sorts of things are represented by the Marianne Moore collection, which brings that part of the collection more up to the present. There's still a few of the people she corresponded with are still alive. So there are the history of the rare book trade in the early 20th century is a really strong part of the collections, represented basically by the archives of the Rosenbach Company, which cover 50 years of buying and selling to and from the foremost dealers and individual collectors and institutional collectors. Shows how how Dr. Rosenbach helped build a lot of collections that are available to the public today, but we can also use it to trace the provenance of individual objects, and evolution of taste in collecting, and so on. There are other smaller but important pockets of medieval manuscripts, incunabula, Judaica, ranging from early printed books up through really the mid-20th century with the Rosenbach brothers' activity in various Jewish organizations, nationally and internationally.
What's an
Oh, incunabula, books printed before 1500, basically the first half century of movable type printing in Europe. Incunabula is a Latin word that means cradle or swaddling clothes. So it's a metaphor for the infancy of printing.
Okay. So it sounds like the collections here really, in terms of manuscripts and printed books, take us from, medieval Europe all the way through the mid-20th century in terms of book history. Do any of these areas, in your librarian's perspective, receive more attention from our researchers who come to the Rosenbach than others? What are the most heavily trafficked collections in terms of research here in the reading room?
The Marianne Moore collection is far and away the most heavily used because it provides not only a very thorough overview of the working methods and professional life of one prolific author, but her extensive correspondence with a lot of other authors, publishers, artists, and so on.
For our listeners who may not know much about Marianne Moore, can you give us just sort of a quick sketch of who she was and the nature of the collection? Because some of our Marianne Moore materials are really what you would think of that you would encounter in an archival environment, manuscripts, typescripts, books, and so on. But we have a lot of other kinds of Moore material here as well. So tell us a little bit about that assemblage.
If you'd lived between the 1920s and the 1960s, in America, you probably would have known the name of Marianne Moore. She was one of the best known and best regarded American poets, both by the general public and by her fellow poets. She won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, etc. She was, especially in her later years, also well known as a sports fan. She lived most of her adult life in New York, and was a dedicated Dodgers fan, among other things. She was a leading figure in the modernist poetry movement, and her writing focused quite a lot on animals and athletes, displays of skill, very detailed observation of visual phenomena. And her poetry's been likened to collage work in that she would bring together in one poem images from a lot of different places. She might write at the same time about an advertisement and an animal she'd watched in the zoo and an Elizabethan poem. She really liked to pull a lot of things together at once. We have all of her working papers, the raw material and drafts for her poems, her prose pieces, correspondence with about 3,000 different people, about every topic under the sun, family letters that go back a couple of generations, her whole working library, which shows the way she annotated books, from children's books to theology to modern art to literature, and drew pieces of all of that into her poetry. We also have the contents of her living room, including little objects and pictures that made their way into her poems.
Wow, such a fascinating set of material for sure. So are there any collections here at the Rosenbach that you wish had more researchers come to use them? What are some sort of areas that maybe haven't received as much attention as they might deserve?
There are parts that are well known, but other kinds of work that can be done in some of them. People have done a lot of work in the Rosenbach Company archives, and I talked about some of the research they've done. There is a lot of quantitative research that could be done. I mean, we know in general the great collectors who bought things and the great collections they bought from. We know in detail about some of those purchases and sales, but both sides of the business, the book and the art business, also sold quite a lot of things to ordinary Philadelphians. Or people bought lampshades, silver ashtrays, they had pictures framed. They would buy also just fine bindings and collected sets of standard authors and so on, the more middle of the road, ordinary people collecting rather than the great bibliophiles and founders of institutions. Because we have the complete sales books and the customer account records, it would be possible to go through and really see, what percentage of the sales came from the art, from the book side, how many were these, the amounts that were spent, how many were these high-level works, and how many were more ordinary things. All kinds of breakdowns that could be done.
That's really interesting, because I think when we think about the Rosenbachs and Dr. Rosenbach in particular, we think of, selling to very, very ultra-wealthy customers and, sort of the heavy hitters on the global scene. But what you're suggesting is that a hidden part of that heritage is that they were also peddling wares to more or less ordinary people here in Philadelphia, and I assume also in New York, where they had a storefront.
Yeah. We do regularly get questions from people who have a drawing, a painting that has a label on the back of the frame from the Rosenbach Company or Rosenbach Galleries. And sometimes we can trace those actual objects through the company archives. But often, all we can tell the people is that yes, the company did a big business in framing. Also, they would frame things that people brought to them. Sometimes, if we know who the buyer might have been, we can trace what that was. But I sometimes joke that probably a third of middle class households in mid 20th century Philadelphia had something on the wall with the Rosenbach Galleries label on the back.
Well, Sid, it is an interesting question what role that sort of work played in the financial stability of the institution. I mean, I would imagine that it was providing a steady stream of income that maybe was at a lower level, but probably then supported some of the bigger acquisitions, some of the leveraging of assets for bigger projects in terms of the ultra wealthy collectors who are spending a lot of money on individual items.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Really interesting. Yeah, and I think that, certainly there's more opportunity to dive into our own story, not just as a place that has a lot of important rare books and manuscripts, but a place that was a central nodal point in the world of book collecting for much of the 20th century.
Right. We can also find out more about Philip Rosenbach's actual role in the art world in dealing. Dr. Rosenbach, no question, the book side of the business on the whole was more important, more profitable. They dealt in more significant high-end things, but Philip has been badly portrayed in the few publications that really talk about him, and his taste in art and his business abilities have both been really unfairly run down. He did buy and sell Matisses and Rembrandts and all manner of fine and decorative art on a quite a respectable level, and looking more at those details would really help to tell us more about he needs a biography of his own. Just talking about other areas of research that are needed. Philip Rosenbach deserves his own biography. He is sometimes a footnote, sometimes the Wolfenfemming biography of Dr. Rosenbach is about a biography and a half, because Philip's always there, because they were business partners and lived together their whole lives. The dynamic between the two of them was very important. Dr. Rosenbach wouldn't have been the bookseller that he was if Philip hadn't taken him into the business. He would have ended up in an academic career somewhere. Philip has not been studied on his own, or not been the focus of a biography. And he really deserves that.
Well, I hope some aspiring scholars are out there listening to this, because I feel like there are so many stories that are central to the history of collecting that have not fully been unearthed, which in a way is kind of remarkable, because you'd think at an institution like this, you would have all the bases covered, but clearly it would, all of these research projects could be life work in and of themselves. So lots to think about. So, Elizabeth, I see that you have some objects on the table that you've pulled for us to look at together, and I'd love to do some looking at you with pieces from our collection, just to get a sense myself of what some of your favorite objects are here at the Rosenbach, and also to give our listeners a little taste as to what they might expect to see if they come here to the reading room to look at some of our holdings. So what do we have out here for consultation?
As with a background in history, my bias is chronological. It's not, we might as well go that way, since this is the first thing up on the pile. This is one of the incunabula I was talking about earlier, one of the early printed books. We have just under 100 books printed before 1500. This is a book printed in 1494 by Wynkyn de Worde, who was a successor to William Caxton, the first printer in England. It is the Scala Perfectionis, the Stairway of Perfection, a very well-known medieval devotional work by Walter Hilton. This is the first printed edition of it. It circulated for a long time in manuscript before that. This particular copy is annotated. Books of this period, especially books that were made for study and devotion, where it was expected that readers would make their own annotations and be in conversation with not only the text, but with other people who had annotated it before. This particular copy was annotated by a Carthusian monk in England named James Greenhow, who was coming of age just about the time the book was printed, and lived for another 30 years afterward. He was a theological scholar and kind of a spiritual director at an English Carthusian monastery. He lived at the Carthusian monastery of Sheen, which had a very close institutional connection with a convent, a very, very well-known place named Sion Abbey. He worked as a kind of spiritual director of giving advice and direction to some of the nuns. This book he annotated for the use of a nun named Joanna Sewell. There are several copies of this book that are known to have been owned by various nuns at the Abbey. And there are a lot of passages here that he's specifically pointed out for her use and attention.
So what you're telling me is I'm looking at this, incunable, in this beautiful black letter typeface, but all of this handwriting all around on the sort of the margins of the printed text. This is all the handwriting of this monk who was essentially trying to give instruction to a nun about how to engage with this spiritual text.
Yeah, there may be some annotations by her as well. In this case, these are her initials, J.S. right here, although we think that those, in some cases, they're not so much, they're not written by her, but he has marked them specifically for you, Joanna Sewell. This is particularly for your attention.
And I'm noticing, Elizabeth, how incredibly pristine the paper is in this book. I mean, you would think paper of a certain vintage would not look so perfectly clear, white, and elegant, but obviously this book is in very good condition.
Yeah, it is. It's been kept in conditions that help preserve it. Of course, its age is a little deceptive, perhaps. We tend to think of old paper as brown and crumbly, but that's because a lot of the paper we use today is made from wood fibers, and in the process of making paper out of those, you have to add acid to break down the cellulose. If you don't wash it out, it gets brown and crumbly, and that's why 10-year-old newspapers are so horrible. But before the middle of the 19th century, paper was made out of rags, chiefly linen and cotton. When you do that, the fibers are already loose and floppy, and you don't have to add acid to them. So older paper is more likely to be in better shape if it's more than 150 years old.
That's so fascinating, because as you're saying this, I'm thinking so many of our books here at the Rosenbach that are older are, as you say, in really good condition. We can use them easily, but the 19th century material often is the most fragile material.
Exactly, yes.
Really fascinating. And I want to, right now we have the book open on a pair of wedges here, but I want to take a look at the binding to see if there's anything. Oh, wow. First I'm seeing all sorts of wonderful pages.
This book belonging to Dame Joanna Sewell, a sister in Sion, pressed the year of our salvation 1000, it says 1500. There's not actually a date on it, but on St. Vitus Day, March, whatever.
Wow.
On St. Vitus Day.
The handwriting is beautiful. I wish my penmanship were that elegant. Okay, anyways, I said I wanted to look at the binding, and we're not going to get distracted. That's exactly what we're going to do. Oh, wow. So we have metal clasps here. Was that still common for printed books? So I think of metal clasps as medieval manuscript in, most commonly, but obviously in the days of early printing, it was still, I guess, part of the style.
Yeah, when printing came into use, a printed book wasn't seen as a brand new kind of thing. Printing was just a way to make more efficient the most tiresome part of making a book, which was writing out the text. Everything else still had to be done by hand: the trimming of pages, the sewing together, the binding, the decoration of the binding. So early printed books looked just like books always had, a book that was written by him.
Well, in a way, I guess this is, in fact, a manuscript as well, because there are so many handwritten components of this particular volume. The main text is printed, but the story of the monk and the nun really make it an even more interesting artifact because of its manuscript or handwritten qualities as well.
That's right, yeah.
Really beautiful.
There's more backstory that some people have studied since. More story than is told in the annotation of this particular book. Apparently, some of Greenhalgh's superiors may have misinterpreted his relationship with Joanna Sewell, and he was his assignment was changed accordingly.
Way to bury the lead, Elizabeth. So you're telling me that this monk and this nun had something going on?
I'm saying that I wish I had time to read in detail all the research that people do on all of our work. I haven't brushed up on all the backstory this time, but it seems that his superiors believed there had been maybe not maybe not something physical going on, but that there was a closeness or a sort of relationship that might lead to unintended consequences. So I will have to refer you to some of the publications.
Please refer me to the publications, because my interest in this incunable has gone from mild to through the roof. This is really a great story, and one that we can use to hook our visitors on tours to talk about the amorous inclinations of the monk and the nun. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing this book with me. I'll definitely want to spend more time with it in the future. I'll put the amorous incunable away in its box while you pull out the next object.
Oh, let's see. I'll stick it in England for a moment and then come over here.
How do I open this box?
Let's see. 1, 2. Oh, right near your right index, you can see the latch there. Just press it. Press in.
Okay.
Yeah, and this does drop down a little bit.
Podcast listeners, I'm virtually useless in reshelving this incunable. Eve is telling me exactly what I need to do it appropriately.
I just opened this box, so I remember how this one sticks out the top.
Oh, so I'm supposed to leave this here?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a shelf.
And this goes inside?
Right.
Okay. And I'm just going to close it like this and pretend like I know what I'm doing. There. Okay. Done. Now what am I looking at here?
This little book is one of several dozen such things that we have. This was known as a commonplace book. We have, the ones we have are from the late 15th, early 16th century, but many of our readers will have perhaps kept commonplace books without knowing it. I say readers, listeners. Many of our listeners will perhaps have kept commonplace books without knowing it. A commonplace book is simply a blank book into which you write things you want to keep. The most often kept and studied are collections of poems, but people would copy out prose passages from any kinds of books they were interested in. They would write recipes, genealogical notes, all kinds of things. Most of ours consist of poetry. Some of the best-known English poets of the late 16th, early 17th century didn't care so much about having their work printed and circulated to a wide audience. In some cases, people like John Donne, who was a clergyman, really didn't want to be widely known for the kind of erotic poetry that he was writing early in his career.
I'm detecting a theme in the objects you've pulled, Elizabeth.
It wasn't intentional, but,
I mean, a good story is a good story.
Exactly. I mean, human nature comes up everywhere, right? There are people behind all of these texts and all of these objects, and people have always been people. Mm-hmm. Some of the great poets of this period were simply writing their poetry out in manuscript, handing it around to other people for comment or just for appreciation. They'd send back. People would not only great poets, but anybody who decided to make up a verse might write it down in their own book. They might send it to somebody else. You might keep your own commonplace book, which would have things that you had borrowed from somebody else, and maybe things that you had read in a published collection of poetry. Mm-hmm. There are some of the poems in this. You see, this seems to be written by several different hands.
Mm-hmm. The verses just pack the page. They really didn't waste space.
Yeah.
You have text going every which direction, little boxes sort of demarcated to indicate where some texts stop and some start.
Yeah.
So they made good use of the paper.
Yeah. This begins with a piece of a poem by Ben Jonson. Mm-hmm. And we have something here just upon Lady Venetia Digby, wife to a gentleman.
Venetia Digby, that's a nice name.
Isn't it? It's very wonderful. Yes. There's a song, Apologetique, in defense of women's
Inconstancy?
Yes, by Ben Jonson. A thing that this person has also done is written. Sometimes he's written when he knows who the author is. I say odds are it was a man, but we do know women kept Commonplace Books, and we don't know who kept this one, so I will say they. The author has written sometimes. If they don't know who wrote it, they will note where they got this. So in this case is Liber Hilt, the book belonging to somebody named Hilton. And there's another, sometimes they will note, this came from the book they borrowed from somebody named Lee. So, you might keep your Commonplace book, and then I might borrow it and copy out several poems that came from you, and maybe also where you'd gotten them, and then you might borrow mine, and then we'd also add poems we got from other people. So we can, by these, trace the way that communities of readers and writers interacted with each other.
Well, I'm also thinking about, we do this today digitally, right? Mm-hmm. You might bookmark a page, or you might use your Twitter feed or your Instagram account as sort of an archive for photos and comments and things like that. And what we have here is, long before digital technology, people were using Manuscript to keep track of their favorite verses or keep track of recipes, other sorts of information that they wanted to hold on to. Yeah. And the Rosenbach, we have a really substantial collection of Commonplace books, don't we?
About 24, and some that belong to later figures, including Charles Lamb. I mean, I kept a Commonplace book in high school when I got really interested in poetry. I didn't know that's what it's called, but I got a composition. Yes, it still exists. Yes. At some point, I decided that it was so much of a chore to copy out that I wanted to be sure I really liked it before I put it in. And eventually I found I'd practically memorized them, so it was easier to memorize, but I still have the book.
Could it be accessioned into the Rosenbachs?
That's a good question. We would have to look through our collection development policy and see whether, as a rule, we haven't been adding things by contemporary authors, but
we could make an exception. Sneak it into the collection. And yours could be the newest Commonplace book in the Rosenbach's holding. I mean, just an idea. I have no vested interest, but suggesting it as an opportunity. Cool. Well, thank you for sharing this object with me. What else do we have?
This is not many decades after our Commonplace book was written, but it's about very different things going on in a very different place. This is part of a large collection we have of documents from colonial Mexico. We also have a large group of colonial Peruvian documents. They go from the earliest conquistadors, Cortés and Pizarro, up into the 18th, 19th century. One large section of the Mexican manuscripts deal with the Inquisition. We think about the Spanish Inquisition as being the best known part of that church phenomenon, but there were inquisitions in various countries, including in Mexico. And it was established not just to root out heresy, but to look at all kinds of religious infractions. And this is a set of records in manuscript from 1661, 1662. This particular collection of documents is the investigation into the case of Jerónimo de Vergara, who was a mixed-race man who was enslaved on an obraje, a large farmer plantation. Jerónimo was brought up on a charge of blasphemy. He had been working on one that or lent out to work on another plantation, and he was being sent back and resisting, and he was about to be transferred back to another property of this owner. He resisted, and in the process of resisting, ended up not only fighting, but cursing the saints That's something that's going to get you hauled up in front of the Inquisition. Now, Geronimo was allowed to give his own testimony, and he explained that the property to which he was being forcibly sent was a place where his wife had been enslaved and had been beaten to death. No wonder he was cursing the saints. It was not a place he wanted to go to. So Geronimo was able to give his testimony to advocate for himself. All sides were heard in the court, and the court ended up ruling not that he was to be freed, but that he was, they did want to get him away from this abusive owner, so that they directed that he was to be sold, and he could not be bought by anybody who had any connection with this abusive owner. So without making waves within the system, the judges were trying to do some degree of right by this man.
It's so interesting because it's like, even though he was trapped within this violent, oppressive system, Geronimo also was able to claim at least some agency and, work the system to his favor to the best that he could.
Right.
Within a deeply unfair, exploitative system. That's really fascinating. And also just to think about how the stories of more ordinary people can come out of records of this nature.
There are hundreds of records within our within this collection. All kinds of people are accused of a variety of crimes. There are other things that aren't criminal records. There are simply registers of marriage. There are work documents. There are appointments of minor officials, and so on.
Yeah, so often when we think about literature, we're thinking about privileging an author who was published, either via print or, as you were looking at earlier, sort of important manuscripts. But a document like this lends fascinating social historical dimension to the work that we can do in terms of unlocking the stories of people whose voices need to be heard.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
What other materials do you have for us to look at?
We're talking about Marianne Moore and her work. And we have time for two things. We're talking about her working methods. And this is a folder of material that she used in the production of one of her poems, Carnegie Hall Rescued. It's one of her later poems in the 1960s. The Carnegie Hall was actually under threat. There was talk about demolishing it to build a new hall, and understandably, a lot of people in a number of communities were upset about this, and there was a lot of campaigning done to restore the old hall instead. And she wrote a poem about this whole process. So here we have a clipping from a New York newspaper about various about the rebirth of Carnegie Hall, and various photographs of Isaac Stern, all sorts of people who've been involved with it, before and after photos. There are a number of different drafts of the poem. Some are written out entirely by hand. This one is in pencil, and then she went back over it, making additions and changes in pencil and some in pen. She would do that for a while, then she would type it out, and again make more changes in pencil and in pen. I mean, she will, over the course of working on a poem, which might have taken her years, she would sometimes change the metrical structure entirely. She would add or remove stanzas, sometimes many stanzas. The title would change. This version is called Glory. Oh, here's some interesting technological references in here. The campaign carried on by long-distance telephone. It's talking about all the ways that this network of people was working on a historic preservation project, really. And another fascinating thing about this brings up another issue that I have recently been trying to get more scholars interested in. Everybody who's worked on her papers is familiar with the fact that she reused paper all the time. She was had a lot of interest in environmental causes before it was so commonly popular. It seems to have started as a matter of efficiency. She worked for a while for Melville Dewey, not in a library capacity, but in a secretarial capacity. He taught her how to use, in days when most correspondence is done by typewriter. He taught her to make her, when you're sending a business letter, you often make a carbon copy of it and save a copy for your files. So he would use the blank verso, the blank backside of an incoming letter, for his carbon copy of his reply. So on one piece of paper, you have what somebody wrote to you and what your reply was. It's saves time and saves file space. So she did that sometimes. You'll find a letter that came in and you'll find her draft on the other side. But she reused paper of all kinds, and we see all kinds in this folder. This draft is written on the back of a letter. This is a form letter from the Metropolitan Library Liaison Committee, showing her interest in support for the New York Public Library system. This is written on, these two pieces actually, are written on the blank side of pages from an old wall calendar here, October 1959. October 59 is past, but so now she can write poems on it. Here's one on the back of a form letter from Who's Who in America, which of course she was listed in. Now some are just on ordinary, sort of lightweight onion skin typing paper. Here's another from, here's a letter from her, yes. That was the back of a letter from a bank in which she had some investments, sort of a form letter about what their standard account types are. There's an ad from a department store. Sale, 15 high-quality, high-fashion bargains.
With poetry on the back.
Yes.
I imagine scholars of this material must spend a lot of time just trying to decode her method in writing a draft, revising it, reconfiguring it, using all of this material evidence.
Yes, that's a standard literary scholarship, and people do quite a lot of that, not only on these, but on some poems. She worked in notebooks. This is a blank envelope that some letter came in. She split the envelope open and wrote on the blank inside.
Wow.
Every inch of space. The other... Everybody knows about this kind of reuse, but nobody's really looked at it as a whole to see how often was she writing on something that had some thematic connection to the... Often she sometimes does seem to intentionally choose this piece of paper because it relates to what she's writing on the other side. How much is just...
What's at hand.
Yeah. Sometimes she made paper covers for her books. Not all of them, many of them. Sometimes it's an aesthetic choice. It's just, this piece of paper is too pretty to throw away. Let's wrap a book in it. So there are all kinds of different things, yeah.
Well, that's a master's thesis or dissertation in the making, right?
Yes, yes.
The material components of Marianne Moore's writing process. And what have we here? This looks like more material from the Marianne Moore collection.
Yes, this is a folder of correspondence with Langston Hughes.
Were they friendly?
Yes, they certainly were. Hughes, poet, novelist, important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. This is a...
Looks like a Christmas letter, what you just showed me. What does that say?
Yes.
On it?
Yes. This is a little promotional flyer that he sent to her for a program. It's part of a series, Sing Out for Freedom, presented by the Greenwich Players in coordination with the NAACP, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, presenting a production of a song play by Langston Hughes called Jericho Jim Crow, play directed by William Hairston with a whole group of gospel singers and other performers, performed in December through February 1963-64.
So she was probably getting this prior to the performances, and maybe he was inviting her to come participate or be in the audience.
Indeed, yes, and this he sent right to her. It's inscribed in the green ink that he very often used. Dear Marianne, happiest of holidays to you, Langston, Christmas 1963.
Wow.
Here is, now this is actually a draft of one of her poems that has ended up in here. Yes, it's on the back of a flyer for a Christmas card sale by a local company. But rather than ordering the personalized Christmas cards, she might have done that. We have to look and see. It wasn't quite her thing. But instead, she used this as a place to write a draft of a poem called Shakespeare in Harlem. She has used this to copy out a poem by Hughes called Shakespeare in Harlem, 1942.
So clearly she admired his work.
Yes.
And was sort of felt connected to the broader Harlem Renaissance literary movement.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, here is a type postcard from Hughes's secretary, George Bass, 1963, the year just before this other. Langston Hughes has asked me to tell you that Saturday evening, November 2nd, his play with music Tambourines to Glory opens at the Little Theater. Mr. Hughes suggests that tickets for the opening be ordered early. So far in rehearsals, the play looks very exciting.
Wow.
Here is a postcard with a little Christmas verse that Hughes sent one year.
I love the fact that so much of this is holiday connected. It's kind of sweet.
Here's a telegram.
Oh, wow.
There's quite a lot of communication in our 19th and 20th century collections by telegram. Miss Marianne Moore. It's a birthday.
It's a birthday wish.
It's a birthday wish, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
May I read it? I want to read it.
Oh, certainly.
So this is to Marianne Moore. I am sure I join many others who love you and your work in wishing you much happiness today and always, Langston Hughes. Wow. What a compliment for her to have that kind of love and admiration from Langston.
Dear Langston, I'm getting myself another The Big C to lend. We have her copy of his autobiography, The Big C. We have the copy that she kept. She's saying she liked it so much, she's getting a separate copy to lend to people.
Wow.
That's a compliment. Yes, very much so. I don't give parties, but when you are near 33 West 9th, come in. And she gives her telephone number. Louise Crane told me to see Black Nativity, another very successful and much revived performance that he put together. I walked all the way to the river, saw a policeman on a horse, and had to walk all the way back. Was in time, and it was worth it. Meant to mention it at the museum. Grateful to you, and she's underlined it.
I feel like we need to do some sort of a little exhibition about their relationship, because clearly not only were they, admirers of each other's work, but it seems that they had a real cordial friendship as well. And I love how all of this just sort of bubbles up from her literary manuscripts and the correspondence that surround all of that material.
Speaking of her admiration for him, here is the letter that she is writing to the Academy of American Poets to nominate him for membership. Wow. Yeah, so she's... Very few persons have the faith and fortitude, the fiber of Langston Hughes. You may be tenacious, but could never attain the sweetness and naturalness of LH's. Oh, anyway.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. This is a draft.
A draft of the nomination for him.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah.
What an incredible folder of materials. I mean, it really goes to show how a scholar would come in here to the reading room, and let's say she or he were going to write an essay on the relationship between Langston Hughes and Marianne Moore. You would sit down with this folder, open it up, and have all these little puzzle pieces to start to put together a really richly textured picture of the relationship that they shared. And just so this is one folder from the Marianne Moore collection. How many folders, how many boxes of material connected to Marianne Moore's work and life do you think we have in the collection?
I always have to go back and look at for the total number of boxes. There are about 85 boxes of correspondence and another 40 or 50 boxes of purely family correspondence, 5 boxes of poetry manuscripts, and many, many more boxes of notebooks, files, clippings. We have financial records, date books, address books.
So this is why so many scholars can devote their careers to the study of Marianne Moore, because there's such rich source material.
Yes.
Really, and that, of course, is in addition to all the published work, which is, available out in the world as well.
Yeah, and people are studying not only her, but, people can come to do biographies of Hughes, to study W.H. Auden, Elizabeth Bishop, T.S. Eliot, Mina Loy, all sorts of other individuals and groups and movements and themes within poetry.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing all of that material with me. I feel like I have a better understanding both of the richness and breadth of our collection and how people come in here into the reading room to do this sort of research. So tell me a little bit more about who the people are who come to the Rosenbach and visit you here in the reading room.
There are about, in normal times, so we have an average of 150 visits a year. About 18% of those, and that's fairly constant over the last 25 years, about 18% of them come from other countries. There are at least 27 different countries we know of so far. The rest are fairly evenly split between people from the local area we just traced by states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and the rest of the United States, D.C. and Puerto Rico. I think there are 3 states missing so far that we haven't got anybody on record from. So if you are in Alaska, Idaho, anyway, wherever you are most welcome to come. About half of the people are traditional scholars, academic faculty, grad students, independent scholars. The rest are a whole mix of people. There are younger students, teachers, writers, and artists who are looking for inspiration for their own work, librarians, curators, dealers. About 20% of the people are just people who are just interested in the material, who aren't looking to publish anything, but just for their own interest and edification want to look at it.
Wow. It's sort of exciting to know that such a large percentage of our visitors here in the reading room are, what you might consider not your traditional academic scholars, but people who just feel inspired to partake of our collections. So how would someone who's interested in making a research appointment and coming to the Rosenbach and doing some work with you and our colleagues go about doing that? What would be the process for both identifying materials in the collection and then setting up a visit here?
There is a whole section on our website on the main menu under heading Research. There's one page lists the online catalogs and finding aids and collection guides where you can get ideas of what is in the collection. Some parts have quite detailed guides that are online. In other cases, most of the printed books so far are still just accessed by card catalog here, but there are guides to the listing all the works by particular significant authors, and other ways that you can find out in general. If you have specific questions, there is a section on a choice on the menu to send a research inquiry. If you're ready to make an appointment, there's a section that says make a research appointment. We do ask for quite a lot of detailed information about where you're from and who you are and what sort of project, if any specific project you are working on, and what your topic is, what you want to see. There's not a sophisticated management system that it goes into on the back end. It comes to me and other staff members in an email, and then we can follow up by email or phone to answer questions and set up specifics. We ask for all that information up front, partly to help guide our conversations with you and partly to help us to feed into the statistics we keep so that I can keep track of where everybody comes from and what sort of thing they're working on.
So my final question for you is reflective in nature. Thank you for giving us a sense of the collections and how our listeners can come and make use of them. But to close our interview, I want to ask the following question. You've been working for many years here at the Rosenbach and have, as I mentioned earlier, really mastered the texture of the collection and provide so much guidance to our researchers and to staff here on site about the nature of our collections and the materials that we hold. And I'm wondering what inspires you in this work to keep at it, and what are some goals that you have in terms of this process of the work of the librarian here at the Rosenbach? What are some goals that you have that you're working on in terms of access and collections management and that sort of thing?
What inspires me is that there's always more to find out. There's always something deeper to dive into. There's always another human story behind something or encapsulated in something. We do so many wonderful things with the collections, different ways of presenting them to the public. We have researchers who come in from all over the world and specialties from literary criticism to archaeology to musical composition, who all teach us more things about what's in the collection. We, as much as we give people material to learn from, then they publish things and they tell us things, and that's how we learn more. So that's the constant interaction with fascinating people who are interested in things and the mutual teaching and learning. I am working now on several projects to complete the conversion of our card catalog to get all of the books into the online catalog, and to complete processing of several other collections. So some big goals to help make more of the information about our collections much more widely available, and to remove myself a bit from the role of mediator in every aspect of what's in the collection to help enable people to find out more on their own.
Well, Elizabeth Fuller, thank you so much for joining me on the Rosenbach podcast. I cannot imagine a better way to spend an afternoon than talking with you about all these fascinating objects that you have pulled. So thanks so much for your time and for being a part of the first season of the podcast.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, literature, and culture. In the next episode, I'll have a conversation with two members of the Rosenbach's board of directors who find inspiration in our collections for their creative work and civic activism: Philadelphia Poets Laureate Yolanda Wisher and Trapita Mason. To learn more about the Rosenbach, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. Our holdings are always accessible to researchers who make a free appointment to visit with Elizabeth in our reading room. You too can be a Rosenbach researcher, and we'd love to see you here sometime soon. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways to help us with projects like this. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. Thank you for your support. If you enjoy the introductory and concluding music featured on the podcast, which was composed and performed by Rosenbach Board of Directors member Yolanda Wisher and her band, the Afro Eaters, and was recorded at WRTI 90.1 in Philadelphia for NPR live sessions, visit WRTI.org to learn more. Also, please consider purchasing Yolanda Wisher's new album. Just visit rosenbach.org for information. The Rosenbach podcast is supported by a grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation on the next episode of the Rosenbach podcast.
Give me eye in my basement, ocean in my pipes, no trust fund in the 215.